presenter is John Blaxland. You've seen the bio of John in terms of his academic career, but I thought it was worth pointing out that John was a military intelligence officer, serving as Chief Intelligence Staff Officer at HQ Joint Operations Command and Defence Attaché to Thailand and Myanmar. He was also the Brigade Intelligence Officer, S2, for the land component of the International Force East Timor, or INTERFET. He was posted as an exchange officer at the US Defence Intelligence Agency in Washington, DC, including for deployment with 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit on USS Boxer, and was awarded a US Meritorious Service Medal for his contribution. I present to you John Blaxland.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So look, it's a real honour and a pleasure for me to join you. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but you've got an august company and I'm really honoured to be included in the mix. I notice you've got some really top-notch speakers, so I'm going to try and not embarrass myself too much. Can I just, Jason, I've got it says host disabled participant from screen sharing.
I'll fix
So
that.
if you can, while I'm speaking, just share that. You would have seen, before we went to the Zoom screen, a map on the screen, which is a RAF planning map centred on Darwin, but spun 45 degrees to give you a sense of Australia hanging off Asia, and of the idea of what the Indonesian president, one before, described as the maritime fulcrum, the space shared between us and Indonesia, and the land bridge, if you like, to Asia. That's a space where few Australians have any knowledge, but of course a conference like this brings to the fore the significance of that real estate and of our experience in that space. And it's really heartening to me to see emphasis placed on remembering and understanding the significance. We last faced an existential crisis in that space, and we haven't faced one for generations, and hopefully we won't in the future, but we can't assume that the future is going to look like the recent past. And so while I'm not at all looking to be predictive, it's really instructive for us to refresh our awareness and understanding of the challenges of operating in our neighbourhood and reflecting on that experience. So I think now I might be able to share, and indeed I can. So I'm going to share that screen again now. And just confirm for me, how long have I got for this session, please?
25 minutes.
Okay, great, thanks, mate. So you should now see my screen, which was seen before, and I'm just going to, can you see the legacies and challenges?
Yep.
Yes. Right, great. So essentially, as you heard, I've been pontificating on military history for a while. And this presentation draws on a few things I've written or edited. Going back to when I was a young lieutenant under David Horner's fantastic supervision as my honours supervisor, and then my master's thesis supervisor. And I notice, of course, Peter Edwards is in the audience, and Peter has had a significant influence in shaping my thinking as a historian as well. So I'm indebted to both gentlemen, and I just acknowledge their presence and their contribution to my intellectual journey, so thank you. Of course, now I know we've talked about this. Wonderful, Peter, to see you there, thank you. Of course, Australia today is a very different place to what it was in the interwar period and even in the early parts of the Second World War. And there's this wonderful quote, and I'm sorry I wasn't there earlier in the conference, so I don't know if it was repeated, but this wonderful line by Robert Menzies, who at the declaration of war said, "It is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of persistence by Germany in her invasion of Holland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war. So this wasn't because we were an independent nation making up our own decision about what to do, and that we, on balance, thought it was a good idea. It was because, as Menzies understood, as a legal mind, we weren't legally free to do otherwise. Now, clearly, Menzies would have done it anyway, but the terminology was really instructive. And of course, we then went to raise the second Australian Imperial Force for overseas service, reflecting the British Empire patterns of our thinking, let alone of our equipment, our techniques and procedures. And that applied equally to the Royal Australian Navy, which was, you know, let's face it, almost more British than the British. Certainly there was no visible, uniform, you know, way of detecting that somebody wasn't serving the Royal Navy versus the Royal Australian Navy. You had to listen to them first to find out. And of course, with the Empire Air Training Scheme, or with what in Canada is called as the British Commonwealth Air Training Program, for some reason they don't like that term, that Empire Air Training Scheme. But of course, a lot of the training was in Canada as part of the Empire and the Commonwealth, following UK procedures, protocols, uniforms and aircraft, almost indistinguishable. Some indigenous aircraft were obviously produced in Mirrorway, being the classic example. And of course, as the war progressed, increasingly the US sourced aircraft were introduced into the Royal Australian Air Force as well. The big turning point, and I don't know if it's been covered yet, but the 1932 Statute of Westminster, which isn't enacted in Australia until the 9th of October 1942, 10 years later. It's just mind-blowing when you think about it. Canada introduced its act following on from the 1932 Statute of Westminster that same year. We took a decade longer. And of course, the Statute of Westminster was all about Britain divulging its responsibilities for formulation of foreign policy for the self-governing dominions. So we have a Minister for External Affairs appointed, we have an ambassador appointed to the United States, which is where I live. It's a beautiful house. Currently I'm residing there is the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. It's a magnificent house. It's a good choice. Actually, General Patton lived there as well in the late 20s and early 30s. It's quite a storied house. So we established relations, formal independent relations with the United States before things really. So we started a little bit before this point, but it was really empowered, super empowered by this. And of course, I don't need to bore you with the details of the significance of the Pacific campaigns, but I just want to bring to your attention this point that the Battle of Guadalcanal, in Australian folklore, it's the Battle of Kokoda that is the most significant one in 1942, the land battles of 42. But of course, we know that in reality, the most consequential one was actually the Battle of Guadalcanal under the O of Solomon Islands, just here, Guadalcanal, just on the Nimitz side of the line, because as we know, Nimitz and MacArthur hated each other's guts, and therefore needed to be, they split the Pacific between them, and Solomon Islands was carved in half, some of it in MacArthur and Australia's space, and some in Nimitz. The Battle of Guadalcanal, the consequence, of course, this is that after the failure of the Battle of the Coral Sea to seize Port Moresby, the Japanese then decide to try and isolate Australia by dominating from Henderson Airfield the airspace here, that is the line between the sea lines of communication between Australia, Hawaii and continental United States. It made sense, and it's why Japan invested a huge amount of its resources, and why I would contend we saw the resort to cannibalism on the Kokoda campaign, because they weren't resourced. They weren't the main effort. And of course, David has written about this, and Peter Dean and others as well, of course, the fact that in the Pacific Theatre, we are operating still with British patterns. and there's a bit of a culture rub point with the Americans. They've got different procedures, different terminology, different structures, and we kind of hold on to our British ones. And we kind of decided we're going to do this not quite independently is the wrong word, but in our own patches. Because when we do operate together, it tends to generate significant friction. But when we reflect on where we've faced an existential threat, an existential crisis, we have, and I know there's a common feature of talking about, Tarakan, Labuan, Balikpapan, and the campaigns of Hollandia in the latter part of the war, but it's really worthwhile thinking about the period of 41-42, because this is when we faced the real moment of the existential threat, when what Joan Beaumont writes about with Gulf Force, with a freshly republished, reworked book on that, which I recommend to you. It's really compelling. Ambon, of course, here, why was Ambon selected? Well, as you know, Ambon had an airfield and a port, so it was a good staging base for potential strikes on Darwin and Australia, as was the case with Dili and Kupang in the archipelago, the Dutch East Indies archipelago, and of course Timorese, Portuguese East Timor as well. And of course, further to the east, a Sparrow Force, which, as we know, was a tragedy, because these theatres, they were correct in identifying them as significant pieces of real estate, critical terrain, if you like, key vital ground, if you like, but they weren't resourced. An infantry battalion against multiple divisions, please, it was suicidal. But the point is that the real estate has enduring legacy. So when you think about contemporary engagement with Indonesia, the resonance for me is greater for Ambon and Kupang and Java than Tarakan and Labuan, which is the natural inclination because they were successes for us. We don't like to focus too much on our failures, but I think it's really important that we do. Okay, so one of the things, and Al Palazzo, in his book on Australia organising the organisation history, talks about, but doesn't kind of stress very much, and to my mind, it's probably one of the most really interesting features about Australia and its application of land power in the Second World War, is that by January 1943, we've got the equivalent of 14 divisions. And that's just mind-blowing. This is 7 million people, 14 divisions. Now, we can't sustain it past January 1943, and we rationalise and we streamline, but this is, you think about the contrast to the army of today. A militia division, a CMF, a reserve division, the historian speaking, the reserve division and the regular force division. If you're lucky, 2 divisions on a good day out of 26 million. 7 million people generate 14 divisions. So, we talk about the situation today being as grim as it's been since the Second World War. We're having ourselves on, pardon me. But anyway, we see this is, so that's all I want to say about World War II. I want to, now obviously, I've been asked to focus on the tail end and the legacy. And the post-war defence policy is really interesting. So we're on the hook for the British Commonwealth Occupation Force of Japan. This is the first time we're required to raise and maintain forces on a regular kind of basis in a non-warlike situation. So the Australian Imperial Force, raised for wartime use only, is rapidly decommissioned and sent home. But we see the foundation of the regular forces, the first peacetime regular operational army, the permanent military force, the PMF, of nearly 12,000, supplemented by a couple of CMF divisions, drawing, of course, in the Armoured Brigade, drawing on the legacy of World War II, which are totaling, as you see, 76,000, and then include their 33,000 in the PMF. This is a fairly muscular force, but there's no money being spent on it, so it's quickly atrophying after the war. And the post-war RAF, we see over 200,000 Australians served in the RAF during the war, and operating 70 squadrons of aircraft, including all sorts of bombers, fighters, reconnaissance, amphibians, contributing to the Empire Training Scheme we talked about. And then emerging from this is plan for the post-war RAF, which proposes 20,000 personnel, which is, you know, if the RAF today had that, they'd be probably pretty happy. And we see there the plan to have mobile task force, including long-range ground attack fighters, heavy bombers, transport squadrons, interceptor squadrons, pretty robust, broad range of skills. Now, what we see is the British Commonwealth Occupation Force becomes the main residual regular component, right? It's stuck up there in Hiroshima Prefecture in Japan. And of course, while it's called the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, shortly after 1946, it's overwhelmingly Australian. But you know, there's a big debate about to what extent Australia identifies as British still at this stage. But certainly in my record, looking through the records and looking at interviews and transcripts of things from that period, a lot of people still very much identified as being British. When challenged by Americans, they kind of thought, no, we're British, what do you mean? And so there was some interesting phenomena. And of course, as everybody knows, everybody who's read those Honours Duty First knows, the 65th, 66th and 67 battalions formed, especially from the AIF, but formed for BCOP because AIF couldn't do it. But by the time of the 47 post-Wyoming plan, becomes the 1st Australian Regiment, the 1st Battalion, and then of course later gets the Royal Moniker, so they become 1, 2 and 3 RAR, Royal Australian Regiment. We see in this period, British pattern equipment, insignia and procedures endured, with many conscious of their status as members of a force nominally identified as British as much as what, but in practice substantively Australian. So we see 3 RAF fighter squadrons deployed in 46, but gradually that's reduced to 1 squadron by 1948. Now interesting, thinking about, and I had this experience working on the Revealing Secrets about singing. Very interesting how from 1945, the Americans really lose interest in Australia. And it's the Brits who have renewed enthusiasm for Australia. In part, it appears because we are a convenient supplement to their efforts to regain empire in the Far East. So we help them in Malaya, we help them in Singapore, we help them in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, what are you saying, John? Well, you know, there's a little bit of a secret intelligence business happening in Hong Kong, to which Australia makes a not inconsequential contribution, but one that wasn't really publicly touted. Claire Bergen and I talk about, you know, Revealing Secrets. But of course, it's the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, the presence there, that is the enabler for our contribution to the Korean War. So, as everybody knows, in June 1950, Kim Il-sung thinks it's a good idea to invade South Korea because Dean Acheson, the US Secretary of State, had gone to the National Press Club in Washington in January and said, you know, America's interests extend to the border of Japan, and by implication, not Taiwan and not Korea. So Kim Il-sung read that as a green light. I can take it, no one's going to stop me. Little did he realise that when you're dealing with what's the right word? A democracy like the United States that can get run hot and cold, shall we say? It started running hot shortly after the invasion. And so, you know, all 3 armed services, basically the elements of BCOF, the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, are committed to the campaign in the Korean War. And I just want to flag here, you know, this is where the war settles down to by 1951-52. This is the patch where the Commonwealth Division is, right? There's 3 brigades in that space, a Canadian brigade, a British brigade, and a composite brigade with an Australian, you know, 2 Australian infantry battalions and some other elements. Very much a mixed Commonwealth brigade, 28th Commonwealth. So when we think about our contribution, it's got to be seen in the context of a army group, you know, campaign that is way bigger than us, right? We are one small fraction in this bit here. That's the division, the Commonwealth Division in that space there. So, yeah, it's useful to keep that in mind. Now, of course, we start the Korean War very much with British standards and equipment. Like we had in 1945, 1950, there's very little changed. Okay, we've got Mustangs, but you know, and that's true. So we're starting to get American equipment, but we're still overwhelmingly like HMAS Sydney deploys. It's a British carrier, British aircraft on board, British procedures. Of course, in this mix, we've got the the Battle of Kapyong, first Afghan battle, as I say. A really interesting campaign, a battle, I should say, with a UK brigade headquarters, an Australian battalion, 3 RAR, a Canadian battalion, 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, UK battalion in depth, US Tank Battalion in support, and the New Zealand artillery gunners in support, the Five Eyes. So there we are, this little patch in Kapyong. This is before the line settled where it would end up forming the armistice in 1953. So this is the Chinese Fifth Base offensive. Once again, overwhelmingly British pattern, British supported. The American tanks are operating in support of a British pattern, British commanded formation. September 1951, the ANZUS Treaty signed. This, of course, this is a significant inflection point, if you like, because we signed the treaty with the United States that doesn't include the Brits, which is a big step, given that from time immemorial, if you like, of Australia as a Western country with English-speaking Western country. In other words, since colonisation, has overwhelmingly relied on the Brits. But we see here, as concurrent with the Japanese peace treaty, the signing of the ANZUS Treaty, that it excludes the Brits. But, there is a sense of this common rhetoric that, well, from 1942, we just gravitate towards America. Well, not so squeezy, not so rapid, because we still work with the Brits for years afterwards. We have 2 RAF squadrons in Malta. What are they doing in Malta, for crying out loud? Well, they're protecting the southern flank of NATO from the risk of a Soviet attack. Right? Meanwhile, we're actively working alongside the Brits at Maralinga, Montebello Island, with, of course, the atomic testing at Montebello, Newfield and Maralinga, right? Which, of course, ends dramatically following the Suez Crisis. It's very interesting to think about this, but this really is a tipping point for the UK. This is the turning point for Australia as well, I would contend. Because for 11 years after the war, we've been still following British patterns, we've been following procedures and using largely British kit. And Menzies, he goes through this embarrassing experience of trying to come to the defence of Sir Anthony Eden, who has actually hoodwinked Menzies all along. Eisenhower, as we know, is absolutely flipping robo at what Sir Anthony Eden has done, and the conniving between the Brits, the French, and the Israelis to seize the Suez Canal after it had been nationalised by NASA. So the Canadians, interesting, come to the rescue to form the first ever peacekeeping force in 1956, and Leicester Peace gets the Peace Prize as a result, and not Sir Robert Menzies, as much as he probably would have liked to instead. So what we see there is a significant shift. 1957, and here I am indebted to David Horner because I was his honours student when I first started looking at the 1957 Defence Statement, doing my honours thesis research. We see the announcement of the raising of a regular brigade group, kind of echoing Beakoff after Korea, right? After Korea, preparing for Cold War tasks, but it marked the change of reliance from the CMF to the ARA as well. So we see here, we've had a 10-year period of the CMF remaining dominant, with British pattern equipment but not going anywhere consequential. and that kit becoming increasingly obsolete, and the procedures becoming increasingly untested, and there's a recognition that, well, we need to actually have something that's going to be deployable at relatively short notice. So we see then a shift, the Pentropic experiment modelled on the US pentagonal atomic warfare structure, a 5-sided division, which the Americans swiftly get rid of shortly after we introduce our pentagonal structure for tropical warfare, or the Pentropic. And this, of course, is what David supervised me as I wrote this little monograph for the Strategic and Defence Study Centre, my first connection with the SDSC that I've been with now for 15 years. So really interesting, we start shifting towards the Americans, and then we don't even keep up with the Americans. They shift away before we even notice. Then, of course, before you know it, we're in Vietnam, where we've got a mixed fleet, but a greater emphasis on US equipment and TDPs, particularly for the RAF, even though they're operating Canberra bombers, they're operating Hueys, they're operating Caribous with Canadian aircraft, but obviously working very closely in line with the US Air Force as well. Similarly, the Navy, while it is still very much the Royal Australian Navy, with echoes of the Royal being the strongest, it's getting US frigates, and it's starting to operate much more closely with the US Navy. In that mix is SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organisation, which, as much as Australia would have liked it to be NATO, it's not NATO. There's no Article 5 Mutual Defence Clause. Australia participates in the headquarters in Bangkok. It works with the Brits and the Americans, but of course it's sidelined in Vietnam. Meanwhile, we're seeing an ebbing of the Brit presence from 1967, a decade plus after the Suez Crisis. We're seeing the withdrawal announced by 1970, the establishment of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Europe rejects Britain's overtures to join the European Economic Community, the precursor of the EU, but they succeed in 1970 at the time that we are starting to withdraw from Vietnam, right? Of course, the joining of the European Economic Community is much more devastating for New Zealand than it is for Australia, because Charles de Gaulle had forced the Brits to basically drop the empire, trading-wise, if they were going to trade with Europe. And that was a pretty heavy price, but it was one that at the time they felt was ready to pay. Now, just reflecting a little bit on the intelligence ties for the last couple of minutes. The intelligence ties from World War II, really interesting phenomenon, because of course we've got these agencies, and David wrote about this, I've drawn this from his book, High Command, which I then riffed off for years subsequently. In all my books, I've always relied on this work that David did as a kind of the starting point for my work. On the Allied Intelligence Bureau, Translators Interpreter Service, the Geographical Section, Central Bureau. What the blazes is a Central Bureau? It's a cover name for SIGINT, right? And Section 22, what on earth is a Section 22? It's ELINT, Electronic Intelligence or Radar. So all of these things, these agencies that are under the dual Australian US agencies, they are the kind of this industrial scale architecture is the precursor of what happens after, which is a range of intelligence organisations that are set up. The Americans leave us kind of a little bit in the lurch in 1945, and the Brits come to our aid. The Brits recognise, as I say, they want us to help in Hong Kong, Singapore and Malaya, so they help us muscle up a little bit, if you like. So they actually, the first head of the Defence Signals Bureau is a guy called Teddy Poulter, who was from Ceylon, from Sri Lanka now, but he was working with the SIGINT agency under the Southeast Asian Command with Mountbatten. And this, of course, is the precursor of the modern national intelligence community of today, which we know and love, which has 10 agencies in it, which I've written about, as well as David and Reese and others. But these 10 agencies in red, this architecture is very much connected now both with the Brits and the Americans, as well as Canada and the United States. So there's an interesting kind of nexus here of the British traditions with the American traditions that come together in 1942, and then the legacy afterwards, for a while there, is very British, but over time becomes a mixture of British and American with an Australian twang, if you like. And we see there arguably what I call the pièce de résistance, if I can use a French term for a five-bias arrangement. The suitable piece of real estate, as Des Ball once described it, the Joint Defence Facility at Pine Gap, right smack dab in the middle of Australia, with a coverage of the world that is unparalleled. Quite extraordinary. So on reflection, we see, final point, Australia's military went through a dramatic transformation after the Second War. The lingering legacy of British-derived technology and operating concepts developed and practiced during the two world wars was profound and would have a lasting effect. In the Korean War, in 1950, what was available drew on the legacy of the Second World War with British-derived practices, procedures and equipment, albeit with an increasingly distinctive Australian flavour. But momentum for this reform was slowed until after the eclipse of Britain's imperial ambitions following the Suez Crisis of 1956, and then a decade later we see a real tipping point, which then is the precursor to us being involved in the Vietnam War. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. My apologies to the room that I let him continue to speak because I was intrigued. We don't have time for questions at the moment, but if you email info@mhhv.org.au with any questions you might have for John, I will make sure he gets them. But it's now time for our first break, but if you've got something else you wanted to say, John?
Yeah, Jason, I did. If I was there, I was going to ask David Warner about the Philippines. And it just really, I really struck that you know, the Americans went into the Philippines, and the Philippines, they'd invested enormously in the 1930s in building infrastructure on the path for independence. So there's grand architecture and infrastructure in Manila especially, but elsewhere as well, that was completely destroyed in the battle for Manila. And you think, well, it's a bit like that classic line from the South Vietnam War, you know, they needed to destroy the village to save it. And there is something about the American way of war that is really interesting for us as we think about our place in the world and how we find an Australian way that is suitable to a middle power with small power pretensions. Thanks very much, Jason.
Once again, thank you, John Blaxland.